In this fourth episode of Frontlines, we dive into the hidden war in Donbas, a conflict Russia denied while directing it from behind the scenes. We'll trace how the war was fought, what the Minsk agreement promised but failed to deliver, how Ukraine lost its chance to recognize rights for Russian speakers and thus ease tensions, and how Moscow used Donbas as a lever to keep Ukraine divided and geopolitically neutralized. Let's start, and remember, if you like such content, do subscribe so you won't miss the last upcoming episode. After the annexation of Crimea, the Kremlin said that it had no further designs on Ukraine. Yet, in the east, masked men seized government buildings, militias emerged overnight, and war began that Russia insisted it was just a local uprising. In reality, it was the start of a frozen proxy war that would shape Europe's security for years. In spring 2014, separatist groups in Donetsk and Lugansk declared People's Republics. Among their leaders was Igor Vsevolodovich Girkin, better known by his alias Igor Ivanovich Strelkov, a Russian army veteran and former Federal Security Service officer. Girkin had already played a key role in organizing the Russian annexation of Crimea and then emerged in Donbas as one of the main organizers of militant groups in the self-proclaimed Donetsk People's Republic. At first, Kiev tried to reassert control with an anti-terrorist operation, but its poorly equipped army quickly ran into resistance. Soon, heavily armed fighters appeared, supported with advanced weaponry that clearly came from across the eastern border. By summer, Russian regular units began slipping into Ukraine, often disguised as volunteers. Key battles like Ilovaisk in 2014 and Debaltseve in 2015 showed that without direct Russian involvement, the separatists would not have held their territory. The human cost was immense. By 2021, more than 13,000 people had died in the conflict, many of them civilians caught between shifting frontlines. The war drew global attention on July 17, 2014, when Malaysia Airlines flight MH17 was shot down over Donbas. Investigators later confirmed that the missile system used came from a Russian military brigade. Nearly 300 people were killed, most of them EU citizens. The tragedy shattered Moscow's narrative of a purely local rebellion and deepened Western sanctions. For many in Europe, it was proof that Russia's covert war had a global consequence. To halt the fighting, negotiations produced two accords, Minsk I in September 2014 and Minsk II in February 2015. Both were mediated by France and Germany and included several key points: an immediate ceasefire, withdrawal of heavy weapons from the front line, the release of prisoners, and restoration of Ukrainian control over its borders, and, of course, constitutional reforms granting a special status to Donetsk and Lugansk. Minsk II also called for local elections in these regions under Ukrainian law and international monitoring. On paper, the agreement seemed to offer a way forward. In practice, neither side fully implemented them. Ceasefires were declared, then broken within days. Heavy weapons were pulled back and then reappeared. Most importantly, Moscow's interpretation of Minsk II went beyond security measures. Russia insisted that Ukraine should grant special status and broad autonomy to Donbas while still keeping it formally in South Ukraine. This would have allowed Russia, through its proxies, to influence Ukrainian politics from within and effectively block Kiev's westward integration. Besides, Donbas was already at that time the most Russia-friendly region of Ukraine, so it was useful to keep it within the country to counterbalance Western-leaning political forces and guarantee the geopolitical function of the country as the buffer between two blocs. Donbas was becoming ever more integrated in the Russian system, so much that already in August 2015, the Russian ruble substituted the Ukrainian hryvnia as the official currency, and its people were ever more alienated from Kiev. So much that the Ukrainian government realized that it was safer politically to keep it separate from the rest of the country. The Minsk solution was too broadly defined, leaving space for the two parties not to implement it. For Kiev, simply integrating back Donbas as it was, effectively a Russian exclave, was unacceptable. Granting Moscow's proxy's constitutional power would have meant giving up its autonomy or even sovereignty. For Russia, it was a clever way to neutralize Ukraine geopolitically without needing to control the whole country. Donbas reintegration was therefore becoming more in the interest of Russia than Ukraine. The latter started to lean prevalently westward, and the stalemate started to play against Moscow's interests. Throughout, Moscow denied being a combatant. It called itself a mediator, even as Russian weapons, fighters, and officers shaped every major battle. The separatist republics built parallel institutions, courts, police, schools, all under Moscow's guidance and funding. No attempts were made by any of the parties towards a recognition of the two cultures, which might have alleviated part of the tensions. For Kiev, Ukrainian was the only identity to be supported, failing to understand that recognizing bilingual rights for the Russian language could have helped ease tensions and favor reintegration, while for Moscow, it was the Russian identity that should have prevailed, especially as Russia did not hide the perception that Ukraine was no more than a province of its big empire, and Ukrainians just a secondary language, or worse, just a Polish-sounding Russian dialect. Meanwhile, Western governments increased support for Kiev. The US and European Union imposed sanctions that gradually expanded, while NATO reinforced its presence in Eastern Europe. By 2017, the US began supplying Ukraine with lethal defensive weapons like Javelin anti-tank missiles. But despite sanctions and aid, the war never ended. Instead, it became Europe's frozen conflict, with the front lines patrolled by the OSCE and periodic flare-ups reminding the world that the crisis was far from solved. For Russia, the frozen war served a purpose. It prevented Ukraine from joining NATO or fully integrating in the West. As long as Donbas remained unresolved, Ukraine's future was hostage to Moscow's leverage. This strategy echoed the one employed earlier in Moldova, where Russian forces stationed in the breakaway region of Transnistria have, for decades, limited Kishnev's room to maneuver geopolitically. In both cases, a small frozen conflict was enough to keep an entire country trapped in limbo. The Donbas War showed that Russia didn't need to conquer a neighbor outright to control its destiny. By keeping a piece of Ukraine under its shadow, Moscow ensured Kiev remained trapped between East and West. Nevertheless, this stalemate started to play against its interest, as Ukraine was visibly abandoning its interest in Donbas, accepting its Russian destiny, and worked towards NATO and EU integration without it. So it comes as no surprise that in 2022, the Kremlin abandoned proxies and deniability and attempted a swift, shock and awe-style full-scale invasion intended to bring about a swift regime change. In our final episode, the war in Ukraine and its development, Russia's hybrid war, also with Europe, Belarus as Russia's launchpad, and Europe's missed chance for peace. What lessons can be learned from 3 decades of confrontation